this next tutorial, we will examine the principle of groupings. And there are two key subpoints under groupings: cohesion and boundaries. In doing text analysis, it is essential that we understand the difference or the distinction between the form of the message and the meaning of the message. The form is sometimes also called the grammatical features or the surface structure. The meaning is sometimes called the semantics or the deep structure. The form includes the actual words and phrases and clauses and other language forms. The form also includes the way that those forms are structured together grammatically. The meaning includes the concepts and inferences conveyed by the language units. The meaning also includes the significant or meaningful relationships between these semantic or language units. In language, there are groupings on many levels. Words join together to form sentences, sentences join together to form paragraphs, and paragraphs join together to form larger discourse units. Every word, morpheme, phrase, clause, sentence, paragraph is a single unit, both semantically and grammatically. And we need to be able to analyze each unit and say, why is this a single unit? With a paragraph, for example, how do we know that this is a single paragraph? How do we know where we should indent? This is what we're going to be talking about today. The paragraph level and other larger units in discourse. How do we know that each of these units are a single unit? The two primary elements that help us understand and describe each of the semantic units are cohesion and boundaries. Cohesion, first of all, is the criteria that indicates some kind of unity within a unit. It's the glue that connects the smaller units within. For example, in a paragraph, it may have several sentences. Well, what is gluing those sentences together to cause them to function as a single paragraph? Boundaries indicate some kind of shift from one unit to another. So as we look at a body of text, we should be able to identify the cohesion, which is the glue gluing the smaller units together, and we should also be able to identify what specifically is marking these boundaries, both semantically and grammatically. Cohesion exists in both the semantic structure and the grammatical structure, and we'll explain that in a minute. Also, boundaries exist both in the semantic and the grammatical structure. So, in this tutorial, we're going to look at these four elements of communication: semantic cohesion, grammatical cohesion, semantic boundaries, and grammatical boundaries. First, semantic cohesion. Now, one of the most common features that provides cohesion within a paragraph is what we call span. And there are several kinds of span. There could be a participant span, where within this paragraph there is one participant who is primarily in focus throughout this span of material. It could be a setting span, which is focusing on a particular place or setting of some kind. Perhaps the first paragraph takes place inside, and then the next paragraph takes place outside of the house or the building. There could be an event span or a time span. Perhaps this part of the text takes place today, and the next part of the text takes place the next day. It could be location span, where this part takes place on the Jordan River and this part takes place out in the wilderness. So, for example, if we are focusing on the participant Peter, perhaps he would be the main focus throughout this first paragraph. Then in the second paragraph, the focus could shift to another participant, John perhaps. And then in the third paragraph, it could go back to Peter, and there would be another participant span. So there is semantically, this information is glued together because it's talking about Peter. And then there is a boundary because there is a shift in focus, a shift in emphasis from Peter to John. And now there is some kind of semantic cohesion. The meaning here is letting us know that John is the primary participant. So semantically, those sentences are glued together because they're all focusing on the same primary participant. Remember, as we already mentioned, perhaps one part of the text would focus on events taking place inside the house, and then the next part of the text moves to the outside. And just the location itself could act as a span, and the fact that all of these events are taking place in the same place could give cohesion to them, causing them to function as a single unit. Or with setting span, it could be like separate scenes in a drama. Span is the most common form of cohesion in narrative paragraphs, but it's not the only kind. Another kind of cohesion that we see is what we call sequencing. We have logical sequencing and chronological sequencing. So sometimes in logical sequencing, there could be a series of events which are almost like dominoes, a cascading series of chemical reactions where A causes B, B causes C, C causes D. And when they are closely linked in that cause and effect relationship, that in itself acts as semantic glue, tying those concepts together within that paragraph. Then the cascading series of events stops and the focus shifts to something else. That will likely signal a boundary. The other kind of sequencing is what we call chronological sequencing, where it is purely time-oriented. But even with purely time-oriented events, sometimes they must occur in a particular order in order to make sense. So for example, with these four statements, John woke up, immediately he got out of bed, then he went to the lake, and he caught a fish. This paints a clear picture. It makes good sense that those events would happen in that chronological order, and that in itself semantically glues these thoughts together within this paragraph. So when we have identified the semantic cohesion, now we need to look to the other side. How is that semantic cohesion marked grammatically? So for example, if we have identified a participant span that focuses primarily on one participant, Peter for example, what is it grammatically that is letting us know that Peter is still the primary participant? Or what is it that is letting us know that this location span is still focusing on the same person? So with participant span, for example, if Peter is primarily in focus, the narrator will often use pronouns like he and him, which lets the reader know that the narrator still intends for Peter to be primarily in focus in your thinking. With time span, there could be time words, some kinds of verb affixes, or the lack of a new time indication. The same with location span. There could be location words or the lack of a new location indication. In a body of text, when there is a specific explicit reference to a change in time or location or something else to do with the setting, that is often the indication of the beginning of a new paragraph or the beginning of a larger communication unit, which of course would be a boundary. With logical sequencing, we in English often use connectors like and, therefore, but, then to glue the sentences and concepts and thoughts together within a semantic unit such as a paragraph. Then often the lack of connector linking sentences together may indicate a boundary. In chronological sequencing, a common grammatical unit to mark the semantic cohesion is recapitulation. This is very common in the Lamogai language in Papua New Guinea. So here's an example from Lamogai. We went and arrived at their village. Having arrived at their village, we went to the men's house and sat down. While we were sitting at the men's house, they brought us some food to eat. This recapitulation or restatement helps to glue the sentences together within this narrative text to help the hearer follow the series of events better and realize this is one cohesive event that is taking place here. It is a single semantic unit. Recapitulation can take several different forms. It might be a word-for-word repetition of what was just stated. It could be a partial repetition, giving just the last part or the most important or central part. Or it may be a summary of that statement, but not in exactly the same words. Sometimes it's just a single word or a short phrase that refers back. With that, they left. Having done that, they came. In a portion of text that uses a lot of recapitulation, it is often the absence of recapitulation that deserves special attention. That very well may be a boundary. Within this paragraph, the information could be linked together, glued together with recapitulation, restatement, but then when you come to a new paragraph, very likely the last sentence of that paragraph would not be linked closely with the first sentence of the next paragraph. Here's an example from Lamogai. The recapitulation is in bold typeface. It says this: we came and came, then we arrived at the village. When we arrived at the village, they brought us some food to eat. After we finished eating, we sat and talked. Then there is no recapitulation, and it starts a new setting, a new paragraph. The next day, we left. Now, it does not say, we sat and talked, then it was the next day. There was a break in there. It could have if we talked all night, but in this case, there is a break which indicates a new semantic unit. The lack of recapitulation in this body of text that uses recapitulation to glue thoughts together, the lack of recapitulation now indicates a boundary, which is a new semantic unit, a second paragraph. Each of the paragraphs in this example is a single unit both semantically and grammatically. It is a single unit semantically because each one focuses on a different setting or a different time. The first one happened one day, the second one happened the next day. And each of them is a single unit grammatically because of the recapitulation. Recapitulation within this paragraph glues it together grammatically and marks the fact that it is a single semantic unit. Then the lack of recapitulation between these two paragraphs marks the fact that this is a transition. The last sentence of the first paragraph is not glued to the first sentence of the second one because there is a separate paragraph, a distinct semantic unit. Now, it's very important when we identify the semantic cohesion that we reflect it appropriately in our translation, that it is reflected grammatically. If we're not careful, we may at times indicate that some parts of the text are glued together as a single semantic unit, even though they really are separate units. Or there may be times where it sounds to our hearers or it looks to our readers like these are two separate semantic units, when in reality they should be joined together as a single semantic unit. So if we're not careful in making sure that we understand how our target audience, our target language, how they mark cohesion in their own paragraphs, in their own discourses, we may cause them confusion. Sometimes my wife and I have been carrying on a conversation, and all of a sudden, in her mind, she switched to a different topic, but she forgot to let me know. She forgot to incorporate the appropriate signals. So I thought she was still talking about the same thing that she was talking about just a moment ago. So that's a prime example of a semantic boundary in her mind, but it does not have the corresponding grammatical boundary to let the hearer or the reader know that this is a shift. This is a shift in focus, a shift in emphasis. It is a semantic boundary. So we've talked about semantic cohesion, and we talked about grammatical cohesion. And we talked a little bit about boundaries too, because it's impossible to really understand cohesion without also talking about boundaries. But just a little bit more about semantic boundaries. In the same way that cohesion within a semantic unit could be indicated by focusing on one participant, a semantic boundary could be a shift to a different participant, or a shift to a different setting, a different event, a different time, or location. Now, grammatically, there could be some kind of connector or other device that is letting the hearer and the reader know that there is some kind of boundary. In some cases, there may not be an identifiable grammatical marker for each boundary, but it's something that we need to look for as we are examining and analyzing text in our target language. Here are some examples in English. Look at the way the word now is used in these four contexts. In Genesis 6:11 it says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight." When we hear that, we as English speakers can tell there is some kind of transition, either a new paragraph or maybe even a major new section. And that is actually introducing the entire account of the flood in Genesis chapter 6. In Genesis 11:1, the account of the Tower of Babel is introduced by saying, "Now the whole world had one language." In Genesis 12:10, "Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while." And in 27:5, "Now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau." When we hear the word now in these four instances, it's clear to us that there is a shift. The narrator has been talking about something, and now he is introducing something different. Of course, we realize that the word now has a different meaning on the very lowest level, but in these cases, this word is not being used in its most common usage. It's not talking about present tense time right at this particular time. This is characteristic of boundary markers or other kinds of discourse markers. Often they will have another meaning on a lower level. In that sense, they tend to hide. A person doing an analysis of one of these passages, Genesis chapter 6, for example, might look at it and say, there is no grammatical boundary marker here because I know what all of those words are. I know what now means. And that could very well be the same in our target language. When we start looking for discourse level markers, they could hide because it could be a word that we have already learned on a lower level that has a specific meaning on a lower level. But in these cases, this same word now is clearly being used to indicate a discourse boundary, a new paragraph or a new major section. For this tutorial, you will use Activity Sheet 8.6. The first thing you'll need to do is identify and mark the paragraph boundaries. Now, don't just look at your English Bible to see where they indented. Some versions indent in one place and others will indent in another place. I want you to determine, based on the actual content, where you think the paragraph divisions are, where you think the semantic paragraphs begin and end. Then you will use the activity sheet to identify and mark cohesion and boundaries in the grammar and cohesion and boundaries in the semantics. For example, under semantic cohesion, in verse 4, we see that there is a participant span that begins, focusing on John. And there is also a location span that goes perhaps through the next 2 or 3 paragraphs. And in the grammatical side, grammatical cohesion, the semantic cohesion within this paragraph is marked with connectors like and also pronouns like he and him, which keep John in focus. Now in verse 9, we see that a new participant span begins, focusing on Jesus. In verse 9 also, we see that there is a passive construction. And when passive constructions are used in Scripture, sometimes one of the reasons is for participant tracking, to keep the main participant in focus. In this case, Jesus is the one who is in focus, so by using the passive construction, he is put into the subject slot, even though he is not the one that is doing the action. He's not the one that is actually baptizing. So we have Jesus coming and Jesus speaking and preaching, and Jesus was baptized by John. In this case, the passive construction marks John as the object of a preposition, and Jesus, as the subject of the sentence, remains prominent. Now, the boundaries may or may not be marked grammatically. Sometimes you'll find an explicit grammatical marking, sometimes you won't. but the boundaries do exist. Verse 9, where we started focusing on a new participant, Jesus, this is the boundary marker, the fact that Jesus is introduced as a new main participant. Also, there is a new time introduced in verse 9. And we see the phrase, in those days, which to us in English does indeed sound transitional. So this is likely a grammatical boundary that is helping us to see in our English translation that this is indeed a semantic boundary. Now remember, the semantic cohesion needs to line up with markings that we find as apparent grammatical cohesion. Also, the semantic boundaries need to line up with any markings that we may identify as grammatical boundaries.